Time for us now to take a look at what's grabbing headlines in the international press. We're joined by Solange Moujon. Solange, somewhat unsurprisingly, a lot focusing on those attacks in New York City.
Yeah, let's start with a cartoon, which is rather self-explanatory if you know that the New York City's nickname is the Big Apple. It's a cartoon by Brian Adcock, and it's in today's Independent. It's the British paper, and on the bottom right, you can see a little black worm that represents the Islamic State group, that's essentially digging inside and turning the city into a quote-unquote bad apple. Now, moving on to how the papers inside the U.S. are covering the attack today, there's a good deal of analysis that's starting to come out. I picked out a few different perspectives. The New York Times has an article entitled, "When the Attacker is in Handcuffs, the Islamic State Group Stays Mum," or quiet. The piece explains that while the jihadist group is often quick to claim responsibility for terrorist attacks, even ones they don't have direct links to, they rarely do so when the assailant is caught alive. Now, why is that? The Times says that we can't be sure, but they put forth two ideas. The first being that claiming responsibility would sort of out the terrorist and not help his or her defense. The second hypothesis that the Times goes into is a theological one. The idea being that the jihadist group doesn't claim responsibility because, according to their logic, the attackers are meant to die in their attacks.
Okay, yeah, a lot of focus on that. However, it seems that the 29-year-old in this case is definitely trying to claim at least to be part of that Islamic State group. Meanwhile, the Washington Post this morning has compared this piece, how Donald Trump is reacting to that, with how he dealt with the mass shooting in Las Vegas.
Yeah, the Washington Post this morning says that October was bookended by tragedy. On October 1st, there was the Las Vegas mass shooting, the worst in modern U.S. history, and on the 31st, the attack in New York City. Now, the paper compares how Donald Trump reacted to each of them, namely that with the Las Vegas shooting, he refused to address the gun issue in the U.S. by saying, quote, "We won't talk about that." Even though that since taking office in January, there have been 283 shootings where 4 more people were killed. Now, the Post compares that reaction to the one Trump just had about the New York attack and his nearly immediate calls for changes to the immigration policy in the U.S. The editorial says that's because the New York attack works well with his ideology, and that for Trump, terrorism is an existential threat to the American people, while mass shootings like the one in Vegas are, quote, "just a thing that happens."
Indeed, yeah, trying to pull focus, but the man behind these attacks did move legally to the United States over 7 years ago. A lot of people saying that it's only after he moved to the US that he became radicalized.
Yeah, that's true. The Atlantic has an article that touches on that. It's entitled, "Why Does Uzbekistan Export So Many Terrorists?" Now, it explains that 1,500 Uzbek citizens joined the Islamic State group, and many have been behind recent attacks and plots. The article wonders if this might be because of strict rules against radical Islam in Uzbekistan. The Atlantic explains that beards like the one the terrorist was wearing in New York aren't allowed back home, and that all of the clerics in the Muslim country are vetted, as are all the pilgrims to Mecca. The article goes into the history of why the country's regime is so draconian against extremism. It says the president knows, though, that the regime's restrictions aren't working, and that some Uzbeks are feeling ostracized at home, and that's why they're moving towards the jihad abroad to find a community and to speak out, actually, against the Uzbek regime.
Interesting things. Now, jumping gears somewhat to the resignation of the UK's Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon. He stepped down 24 hours after Theresa May announced a cabinet inquiry into sexual misconduct by her ministers.
Now, I'd like to take you through a quick run-through of the headlines in the UK, and Michael Fallon's face is on nearly all of the papers there. And the language that the papers have used is rather rough. The Daily Telegraph says the Westminster scandal has claimed its first scalp. Now, Fallon has admitted to, quote, falling short, but he hasn't gone into what exactly he did, creating speculation that there may be a history of sexual misconduct in his closet. The paper Metro ran with a headline that uses the word sleaze. We'll see it come up right there. Now, The Sun went with a clever play on words. Fallon, or fall on his sword, or Fallon falls on his sword. Now, let's take a look at also a cartoon that explains what could be at stake for Theresa May's government if more of her ministers resign or are forced out because of sexual misconduct allegations. Now, here you have two window washers saying, quote, "We better get a move on while we still have all the MPs to do," hinting that there may be a big cleaning out of MPs that is ahead for Theresa May's government. The cartoon hints that Michael Fallon may just be the first head to roll.
Okay, well, sadly, it's on that not so light note that we're going to have to end this press review, Solange Michel. But thanks so much for giving us a flavour of what's taking up space in our international papers.